Right. Okay, once again, welcome to the Middle East 101 lecture series 2023. This lecture series gives you a comprehensive overview of the Middle East region and its impacts on Singapore and the world. Today's lecture is the third in this series in which we focus on Israel and Turkey. And this lecture will be presented by my colleague, Dr. Jean-Luc Saman. I'll be the moderator for the day. Since this lecture is being conducted both in person and online via Zoom, once we enter the question and answer round, the participants physically present here in the room may raise their hands to ask questions and wait for the mic to come. The online participants may send in their questions to the event team through the Zoom chat box. Let me now briefly introduce today's presenter. Dr. Jean-Luc Saman is a senior research fellow at the Middle East Institute, specializing in Middle East strategic affairs, with a particular focus on the Israel-Hezbollah conflict and the evolution of the Gulf security system. Prior to joining MEI, he held various positions in the policy sector. He worked as a visiting scholar with the RAND Corporation from 2007 to 8, and as an advisor at the Directorate for Strategic Affairs of the French Ministry of Defense from 2008 to 11. He then gained extensive experience in the domain of military education and training. First, as a deputy director for the Middle East faculty for the NATO Defense College from 2011 to 16, and as an associate professor in strategic studies with the UAE National Defense College from 16 to 2021. Dr. Saman is a highly accomplished author with numerous impactful publications on the Middle East, and his latest book, published this year by IB Tauris, has been well received by the strategic community. The title of this must-read book is New Military Strategies in the Gulf, The Mirage of Autonomy in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. With this, I hand over the floor to Jean-Luc, please.
The policies of Iran in the region, and to discuss how Iran, as a regional player, is able to shape the politics, the disputes in the area. We're going to continue on that theme with two countries, and as you can see on the slide, the first slide, the title is Non-Arab Regional Powerhouse. So the idea was to look at those two countries, Israel and Turkey, and how they also matter in terms of regional policies with the Arab world, but also with external players, and in particular the US as well as China. So discussing two countries at the same time, so discussing two countries can be challenging in a sense that I'm not going to assume that these are two countries which are identical. So what we're going to do here are basically four things. First, to understand the political systems in both countries. Again, given the time constraint, I'm not going to pretend to give you the full details of the way both countries operate at the political level, but to see what is the nature of their political systems. Then after that, looking at the foreign policy orientations of these two countries. What are the key principles, the key objectives which are assigned to their foreign policies? After that, I'll look at the bilateral relationship, and this is something that has been evolving remarkably in the last 2 years. So we are at, I would say, at an interesting time to discuss Israel-Turkey relations. And finally, to look at Israel-Turkey in the new Middle East. And when we talk about the new Middle East, this is something that you'll see in other lectures during this semester, what we characterize as this combination of new great power competition in the area between US, China, as well as these new ambitions for regional actors such as the Gulf states, Iran, and Israel. So that is the program more or less for the next 45 minutes. So, as I said, we'll start with the politics in both countries. And to understand politics in those two countries, it's worth exploring 5 aspects: national identity, political system, political leadership, economic environment, and security priorities. And you'll see that we have here some interesting similarities as well as differences. In terms of national identity, we have here 2 democracies. The current system of Turkey was established in 1923. As you know from history, this followed the fall of the Ottoman Empire with the creation of the Republic of Turkey. The founding father of the Republic of Turkey being on this picture at the bottom, Mustafa Kemal, also known as Atatürk. And as the first president of Turkey, Atatürk had created a specific identity, which was first secular. The idea was that Turkey would would explicitly create this division between state and religion, so a secular country, as well as a parliamentary republic. The inspiration, among others, for Mustafa Kemal was the French Third Republic of the late 19th century. What's interesting for us is that when Mustafa Kemal created in the 20s the Turkish Republic, there was one Jewish leader who was very influenced by Kemal, and that was David Ben-Gurion, who is here on the picture at the top. David Ben-Gurion, who would later become the first prime minister of Israel, lived in Istanbul for a few years and was actually inspired by the Turkish model. He considered that the Turkish Republic could be inspiration for what could be one day modern Israel. So again, you here have the idea of secularism. That's something we'll go back probably later. But initially, Israel, just like Turkey, was created as a secular country. It doesn't mean that religion was out of the picture. In both cases, Islam for Turkey or Judaism for Israel were very important in shaping the identity. But in terms of the political system, this was made as a division. So that's the first element, this idea of national identity in both countries. Also, another important element I mentioned, modern Israel. Behind David Ben-Gurion on that picture, you can see the picture of the founding father of Zionism. So Theodor Herzl, who was the first leader of the Zionist movement in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So that is for the national identity. Now, this leads us to discuss the political system in both countries. As I said, we have here 2 democracies, and I'm sure some of you are already thinking, well, these are not perfect democracies. And that's probably one of the similarities, which is the most interesting to discuss. Turkey started as a republic, but very quickly the military had a strong role, in part because Mustafa Kemal was coming from the military. But the military played a major role in Turkish politics, with several coups happening during the following decades. That led to the idea that Turkey was not really a democracy, that even though you had elections, those were heavily pressured or constrained by the military. In Israel, the situation was also difficult for other reasons, which related to the way the Israeli political system integrated or not its Arab minority. The Arab minority that had been staying in Israel since the founding of the country. So this is why, for many political scientists, they tend to qualify both countries as illiberal democracies, meaning that these are democracies, but in some aspects, you see some elements that deny basic notions of democracy. This is even more the case in the last, I'd say, 5-10 years in both countries. First, in Turkey, you had an evolution of the system with a major reform in 2018. Initially, Turkey was a parliamentary system. It now moved to a presidential system. With the decision of President Erdogan, who's here on the picture, and I'll come back to him in a few minutes, to strengthen the power of the presidency. Many critics say that this is mostly to weaken any forms of checks and balances against his own presidency. And that is the reason there have been concerns about the future of democracy in Turkey. In addition to that, we've seen in Turkey severe restrictions on freedom of expression. A lot of the independent media, newspapers have either closed or have seen their means, their resources shrinking. In Israel, this is less the case, at least for the moment, but what we've seen with the new government, so you have a new government which started last January with Prime Minister Netanyahu, with a major reform targeting the judicial system. So this is a reform that explains what you see in the streets right now. You have people from all backgrounds, either from the tech industry, from the reservists, going into the streets protesting. Because there's the fear that the current reform will challenge the rule of law in Israel. There's the fear that this is going against basic principles of having the judiciary power checking the power of the prime minister and the government more generally. So we see here also some very critical questions on the nature of the political system in Israel. This leads to the third point, political leadership, because for more or less the last 2 decades, it's impossible to talk about Turkish and Israeli politics without considering 2 leaders that arguably are among the most important ones in the history of these countries. You have here on the picture President Erdogan in the case of Turkey. He has been in power for the last 20 years without any interruption. So he was first elected as prime minister from 2003 to 2014, and since then as president. And that's when it started becoming the president, that's the moment he implemented a reform to strengthen the position of the presidency. In the case of Benjamin Netanyahu, that's also the longest serving prime minister in the history of Israel. He first was prime minister between 1996 and 1999, and then a second time for 12 years between 2009 and 2021. And finally, we saw him coming back to power despite many scenarios or many speculations that he was over. He came back to power last December. What's interesting in comparing both leaders is that you see some similarities. Both came with major ambitions to modernize the economy of both countries, and they were actually successful, at least in the first years in both cases. to modernize the economies of the countries, to turn them into significant powerhouses, not just in the Middle East, but within the OECD. But they also targeted any dissent. So they personalized power. They created a system of elite that depended on them. And they are, in a way, the most responsible leaders for this trend towards illiberalism in both countries. So that is for political leadership. Let me now turn to the economic environment. As I said, both countries represent major economies, not just in the Middle East region, but more broadly, we've seen how both countries are perceived as important economies. These are the two only Middle East countries which are part of the OECD. And you probably know already the reputation of Israel as the startup nation. Israel is one of the is after the US the country with the biggest number of unicorns. So this is this has become part of the national economic environment. The tech industry is an element of national pride in Israel. But there are some questions that come also with this economic environment. Mostly in the case of Turkey, we've seen since 2 years ago a major financial crisis in Turkey with the collapse of the currency, which in a way put an end to 2 decades of major growth in Turkey. So that actually challenged the legacy of Erdogan at the economic level. When it comes to Israel, the issue is different in a sense that you have now a kind of 2 economies at the same time. You have the tech economy, which represents a major element of wealth, of income, but the rest of the society, which does not really benefit from that tech industry. That tech industry is actually more integrated into the economy of California, in a sense. The rest of the population suffers in a way from the cost of living. Tel Aviv competes with Singapore for being the most expensive city on earth. And this is in many ways something that explains also the current divide within the country, because you will see a lot of the people from the startup industry being, let's say, from the secular background, usually living in Tel Aviv or in Tel Aviv area, and those that are more into traditional, more Middle Eastern economy will be more from a religious background and usually tend to vote for the right. If I summarize very quickly this divide, but you see here how there's a kind of alignment between the politics, the identity, and the economic situation. Let me now move to the security priorities, because these are 2 countries in the Middle East, so they have security priorities which are at the top of their agenda. And both countries would put terrorism at the top of their security priorities, with different actors in both cases. In the case of Israel, you can see at the bottom here fighters from Hamas. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Hamas, Hamas is an organization, an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestinian territories, that was established in 1988. So during the first Intifada, they operate mainly in the Gaza Strip, but also have a presence in the West Bank. Hamas is today the biggest military actor on the Palestinian side, and in particular due to its arsenal of rockets. So anytime you have a conflict between Israel and Hamas, and we've seen four major conflicts between Israel and Hamas since 2008. So if you do the math, it's more or less one conflict every 3-4 years. Anytime you have this, you have a wave of rockets that now are able to target any major city in Israel. So Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, which is in the north. And we're talking about, for instance, 100 of rockets which are fired in less than 5 minutes. So this has become a major issue at the security level. Let me show you on the next slide the map, just to give you an idea, because you can see here, and due to the time constraint, I'm not going to give you all the details of the history of Israel-Arab conflicts. But to understand the situation, the conflict with Hamas, it's necessary to go back to 1967 with the war. You see here on the two maps on the right, the situation before 67 and the situation after. Basically, the current state of Israel politics with the Palestinians is still heavily influenced by the military victory of 1967. The fact that after that, Israel occupied Gaza and the West Bank. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. That was a decision made by Ariel Sharon. And since then, Hamas took power. You can see here on the maps how small Gaza is, but also the proximity. This is the reason also why it doesn't take too much of a rocket for Hamas to be able to reach Israel. With a rocket that is able to fly to up to 10, 15 kilometers, you can reach big cities in Israel. So that is for the situation, the security situation for Israel. With regards to Turkey, and I'll just go to the previous slide, you see on the top the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK, which is for Turkish government the biggest security threat. It is considered a terrorist organization. It was created in 1978. And until today, despite several attempts at negotiation, there is kind of a war on terror between Turkey and the PKK. What's making things even more complex is the Kurdish presence across the Middle East. And I'll go, because to understand the current state of Turkish-Kurdish relations, we also need to take into account that you have a Kurdish presence in basically four Middle Eastern countries: Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. What's making things complex is that you have cooperation, coordination between the PKK and some other movements, for instance, the Syrian Kurdish organizations. During the war against the Islamic State in Syria, the US coalition decided to strengthen or to use the Syrian Kurdish forces as proxy and to provide them with military support. The Turkish government opposed that, and actually until today is in a major dispute with the US on this issue, because they consider that the Syrian Kurdish forces are allies of the PKK. So by extension, they consider that this is supporting terrorism against them. So that is for the security priorities. Let me move now to the next slide. We'll now look at the foreign policy orientations of those countries. And here as well, you'll see some interesting similarities. These are two non-Arab Middle Eastern countries. And until today, their foreign policy has been primarily anchored into the Western orbit for two main reasons. First, with regards to Turkey, Turkey is a member state of NATO. This is something that is sometimes forgotten, but Turkey is one of the oldest members of NATO. It joined NATO in 1952. And as a result, Turkey also hosts US military base inside Turkey. Not only does Turkey have US soldiers on its territory, it also hosts US nuclear weapons. That's a very important element because that is a relic of the Cold War. At that time, it was mostly to deter the USSR. But until today, this is an important element. This, in a way, is opposed by some parts of the public opinion, especially the more conservative, more traditional Turks that have a negative view of the US. But despite all the tensions between Erdogan and the US governments, Turkey has not challenged that presence, this US military presence, and has not challenged at all its membership of NATO. It's important to keep in mind that any decision within NATO is taken by consensus. So Turkey, like any other country member of NATO, can oppose any decision. And it did that recently when Sweden wanted to join NATO. Turkey was able to threaten its veto. Eventually, the US administration was able to convince the Turks to accept Sweden membership. But that tells you how Turkey is an influential member of the Atlantic Alliance. In the case of Israel, Israel is not a NATO country, but it does enjoy a very strong and arguably probably one of the strongest military partnerships with the US. We discussed that during the first lecture 2 weeks ago, with the fact that Israel's security is probably the first and most important priority for the US in the Middle East. And until today, you have about $3 billion each year, which is provided by the US taxpayers to Israel's armed forces. So this is quite significant. And this is the reason why, despite all the public discussions in both cases, Israel and Turkey, you have in both cases an important proximity with the Western countries, because this necessity, in both cases, they benefit a lot from their from that dimension. Let me now move to the second part, which is the Arab world. And here it's also important to see that both countries have had difficult relations with the Arab world. It seems more obvious in the case of Israel. I'll go back to that in a minute. But even in the case of Turkey, it's worth reminding that Turkey, especially in the Middle East, especially in countries like Syria, Lebanon, is marked by the memory of the Ottoman Empire. If you go into, if you read the history textbooks in the schools in Lebanon, in Syria, they heavily talk about the torture that they suffered from the Ottoman Empire. In a way, if I'm using another analogy, it's similar to Singaporean memories of Japan's occupation. And until today, that constrained the ability of Turkey to play a major role in the Arab world. They tried as much as possible to spread the Turkish model of governance, especially using the idea of sharing the same customs, the same religion. But we saw after the Arab Spring in 2011 that this reached very quickly its limitations. There was also, at a certain point, an ambition from Turkey to create strong ties with its Arab neighbors, in particular with Syria. You can see here an old picture, something that is sometimes forgotten, but President Erdogan and his counterpart from Syria, Bashar al-Assad, used actually to be close partners. Before the war started, Erdogan displayed his partnership, his even friendship. They actually went for a short vacation with their spouses together. So that was before the war and before both countries found themselves on the opposite sides. This also tells us the difficulties of Turkey in building that Arab policy. In the Gulf, that was also quite challenging. Turkey has close ties to Qatar, and Qatar opened a Turkish military base in 2014, the first one since the end of the Ottoman Empire. But Turkey has also very difficult relations with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. I'll come back to that later. With regards to Israel, as I said, this is more obvious because the notion of a Jewish state in that territory that was called Palestine has been denied and resisted by the majority of the Arab countries until today. On the next slide, you'll see here the situation as of today with regards to what are the Arab countries that formally recognize Israel and those that have informal ties and those that have no relations at all. What's interesting is that recently we've seen a major wave of what we call normalization. For a long time, the majority of Arab countries just didn't recognize the existence of Israel. That meant that there was no participation of Arab states to any diplomatic meeting involving Israel. But in recent years, we saw Morocco, we saw Sudan, we saw the UAE, we saw Bahrain, and possibly in coming years, Saudi Arabia recognizing Israel. That's a major step. And that is the reason also why we talk about the new Middle East, because here this is something that historically will change the way we think Israel's position in the Middle East. Let me move to the next slide, which looks at the relations with Iran. And here, the relations are very different because in the case of Israel, Iran for the last 2 decades has been an existential threat. You see here a rather famous picture of Prime Minister Netanyahu going to the UN General Assembly and making the case with this cartoonish picture that he has in his hands that the Iranian nuclear program has to be stopped. Israel has been announcing that Iran would get nuclear weapons since the late 90s. And since then, this has been, for good or bad reasons, we can argue about that, but this has been seen as an existential threat. The fact that there have been statements from former Iranian officials that they want to erase Israel. There is the vivid perception across the Israeli political community that Iran has the potential and the intention to destroy, to erase the Israeli project, the Israeli nation. In the case of Turkey, the relation is much more ambiguous, much more ambivalent. Officially, there have been talks, there have been ties with Iran, but at the same time, Turkey is again a member of NATO, and a lot of what NATO does in Turkey is actually to protect against Iranian ballistic missiles. So there is the perception that Turkey, on one hand, will have this public diplomatic statement of having good relations with Iran, and at the same time, militarily benefiting from the presence of the US, because there is the argument that the US military presence in Turkey, and in particular the nuclear weapons, is a perfect deterrent against anything that Iran may be tempting to do in the near future. So that is with regards to Iran. Finally, we need to discuss the Asian element here. And both countries, just like the majority of the Middle Eastern countries, have embraced the growing presence of Asian powers in the Middle East, in particular China, and in particular at the economic level. Turkey was joined the Belt and Road Initiative formally, and Israel is also a major recipient of Chinese investments in the tech industry. Huawei has one research and development center, the only one in the Middle East, which is located in Israel. So there is a lot of investments, both in Turkey and in Israel, coming from China. In addition to that, Turkey has also maintained strong relations, or let's say good relations, with Russia, especially in the military domain. Turkey, despite pressures from the US, decided to buy a Russian air defense system, the S-400. Keep in mind that this is a system that the US considers to be a threat, and you have US soldiers on the Turkish territory. As a result, the US decided to cancel the transfer of the F-35 to Turkey. Turkey was among the countries that invested in the development of that fighter jet. So this was a huge decision made by the US to cancel the participation of Turkey in that program. So Asia, broadly speaking, is part of the foreign policy orientations of both countries. In the case of Israel, we could argue that the country has been much more cautious in trying to maintain its distance from China than Turkey because of the US pressures. Let me move to the third point, and I'll have to go quicker because I realize I'm taking too much time on the previous slides. The state of bilateral relations. Interestingly, the two countries have had bilateral relations for a long time, starting in the 50s. Turkey was part of what Israel called its periphery doctrine back then. So the periphery doctrine in the 50s, which was designed by David Ben-Gurion, could be summarized by the idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Israel was looking at the map of the Middle East, considering that it was surrounded by Arab countries that wanted its destruction. So Israel considered the only way to overcome that situation is to create strong ties with other countries, those countries which are at the periphery of the Arab world. And that's how they created good relations in the 50s with Turkey, with Iran under the Shah, and with Ethiopia, which at the time was considered as a rival of Egypt under Nasser. This worked more or less for several decades, except that there was what historians call the mistress syndrome. Turkey, especially the Turkish military, liked to have good relations with Israel because they got access to the Israeli military systems, they got access to Israeli military training, but they were much more cautious when it came to public relations. They didn't want to antagonize the Arab world. So usually at the UN General Assembly, Turkey sided with the Arab countries against Israel. So you had Turkey opposing Israel, for instance, during the 67 and 73 war, but at the same time enjoying military cooperation. That relation, however, reached a moment of tension in 2010 when you had the crisis of the flotilla called the Mavi Marmara. This was an NGO from Turkey that tried to cross the Mediterranean and to reach the Gaza Strip. Now, at that time, until today, actually, you have a naval blockade of Gaza, which is executed by the Israeli Navy. So the Israeli Navy refused the access to the flotilla. The ship tried as much as possible to enter the water of Gaza. Eventually, the Israeli Navy started firing, and you had people from the NGO getting killed. This led to a major diplomatic crisis. And after that, you had a decade of basically escalation between both sides, with President Erdogan repeatedly condemning Israel. This eventually came to an end in 2022, when both sides decided to restore diplomatic relations. That is an important element. You had until last year a major dispute, but now it seems to be a new chapter in the bilateral relation. There are several aspects that explain the importance of the bilateral relations at the moment. With regards to Israel, they consider that having good ties with Turkey is actually a way for them to improve their intelligence and their assessment of the situation in Iran. For many years, there has been the idea that through the relations with Turkey, Israel can improve its intelligence collection on Iran. There's also the issue of Hamas. Until recently, Hamas had its political office in Istanbul. You have here on the picture at the bottom, Ismail Haniyeh, who's one of the major leaders of Hamas, who lives in Turkey. Israel hopes that with the new relations with Ankara, the Turkish government will basically reduce the presence of Hamas in Turkey, and that eventually this could actually weaken the Palestinian organization. Finally, on the Turkish side, having good relations with Israel is also important because there's the idea seen from Ankara that having good relations with Israel helps to have good relations with the US. And that's one of the major motivations behind Erdogan's decision to mend ties with Israel. Let me move to the fourth and final point of my lecture, which is Israel, Turkey in the new Middle East. And I briefly mentioned earlier the wave of normalization that we saw between Israel and Arab countries. So I'll get into closer details here. This started with the Abraham Accords. So the Abraham Accords was an agreement signed in September 2020. You see here the picture at the White House, so the time of President Trump, who was joined by Prime Minister Netanyahu, with the foreign ministers of both Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. What's interesting is that following that first agreement, two other Arab countries decided to normalize relations with Israel, Morocco and Sudan. There have been speculations that other countries would join. At a certain point, there was speculation regarding Oman. There is bigger speculation at the moment regarding Saudi Arabia. But as of today, these are the only countries that sign agreements with Israel, in addition to previous agreements that had been signed between Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and Mauritania. But what's interesting also with the Abraham Accords is the next slide, the creation of new initiatives. The fact that Israel normalized relations with Arab countries also enabled new regional initiatives that could not have been conceived in the past. One of them is the Negev Forum. The Negev Forum is an annual conference that took place for the first time in 2021. You have Israel joined by the US and several Arab countries. So here you see on the picture, Egypt, Bahrain, Morocco, and United Arab Emirates. The idea is to have a forum to discuss regional security issues. And that is quite that's unprecedented, to be full stop. You didn't have a forum like this because Arab countries, as I said before, didn't recognize Israel. But now you have this forum, and it has several working level committees with diplomats from the foreign ministries of all these countries meeting regularly to discuss security issues in the region. And that is a significant development. Some critics say that we need to see if it can deliver on anything, because at the moment, there has not been any concrete progress on, let's say, the Palestinian issue or terrorism issues, thanks to this Negev Forum. And for instance, Jordan refused until today to participate because it considers that it doesn't do enough on the Palestinian issue. But putting the critics aside, the very existence of this forum is an example of this new Middle East. The other byproduct, in a way, of the Abraham Accords is I2U2. And I2U2 is an acronym that stands for India, Israel, United Arab Emirates, and United States. That is minilateral, meaning that this is an ad hoc reunion of four countries. This has been coined, maybe for bad reasons, the Quad of the Middle East, because you have the United States and India. What's interesting is that so far it focuses mostly on economic issues, because Israel and the United Arab Emirates didn't feel comfortable with this idea of a Middle East Quad. But again, here, this is a format that could not have been conceivable without the Abraham Accords. Because the Abraham Accords normalized relations between Israel, and UAE, and even India, in a sense, would not have been comfortable, let's say, 2 decades ago, being in a public format like this with Israel. So that's also part of this new Middle East. Finally, with regards to Turkey, Turkey at the time it restored its ties with Israel, also decided to restore its ties with what we call the Quartet, which is Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt. This is the Quartet, or this group of countries that implemented the blockade of Qatar, which was supported by Turkey. And after the lifting of the blockade, Turkey decided to restore ties with the Quartet, and in particular with Saudi Arabia, as you can see here with the picture of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The reason behind this reconciliation is primarily economic. As I mentioned earlier, you have a very significant financial crisis in Turkey, and Turkey now hopes through this reconciliation to attract investments from Gulf countries, in particular from UAE and Saudi Arabia. I'll stop here, and this is my last slide with the 5 key points that I'd like, in a way, for you to remember from my presentation. The first one is that we're currently witnessing contentious politics in both Israel and Turkey. The details of these tensions are different, but they crystallize in a way around the figure of both leaders, Erdogan and Netanyahu. But it's important to see that you have in both countries a trend towards illiberal practices, illiberal democracy, and that creates this idea of toxic domestic politics. You have also an important element, which is the resumption of bilateral relations that happened last year. But as I said, it's important to keep in mind the decade of disputes, because it will probably take time to see both countries really getting closer to each other. And one big test will be the evolution of Turkey-Hamas relations. That's probably something that is closely monitored by Israel at the moment. The third point is that despite all the rhetorics, especially in the case of Turkey, these are 2 countries which are still primarily investing on Western partnerships when it comes to their security policies. Turkey, as I said, is a NATO member, and Israel relies heavily on the US for military assistance. It doesn't mean that Asia, and in particular China, are not a part of the picture. We see in both cases this process of foreign policy diversification towards Asia. This is important, especially in the case of Turkey. Turkey has been increasing its engagement with Asian countries because of the tensions with the US. And the final point is that these are countries which are active players of the new Middle East architecture. I mentioned some of these initiatives, the Abraham Accords, the Negev Forum. And so what's interesting is also to see that they are players in this ongoing movement of reconciliation and cooperation that we see in the Middle East. It's an interesting development, but as I said, there are questions, uncertainties on how far this can go. Let's keep in mind that historically, regional initiatives in the Middle East have a tendency to fail. So we'll see if those new initiatives can succeed where others did not in the past. I'll stop here. I'm sorry for going over time, and I think we have time for the Q&A. Thank you.
For the audience, now we enter into the question and answer round. Please raise your hand and let me know if you have any question for our speaker.
My name is Jin Sok from Energy Studies Institute, a research fellow. As I'm an energy market researcher, I'd like to ask, is it possible the development of Leviathan gas field in Israel and how it affects the relationship with Turkey? Because I heard that they had plans, the Israel and Turkey, they developed, Turkey wanted to import natural gas from Israel, and Israel had many different plans, export to Egypt or export to Turkey, and I'm quite curious how this discussion and development I'm going, how what the development what you have mentioned is affecting this very important gas project, which is have a large volume of natural gas. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. This is a great question, and due to the time constraint, I didn't mention the gas issue, but that's a key element in the equation, and especially in the last 10 years. Because it started in a very confrontational situation. At first, you had Israel joining projects with Greece, Cyprus, against Turkey, especially when it came to gas exploration in the Cyprus exclusive economic zone, which was challenged by Turkey. So for many years, Israel and Turkey were on opposite sides when it came to gas exploration in the East Mediterranean. More recently, we saw, and we could argue that the diplomatic reconciliation was also motivated by common projects in gas exploration, gas development. Because now you have the East Mediterranean Gas Forum that has been institutionalized, something that didn't exist 10 years ago when there was this dispute. And we have to keep in mind that initially Turkey sent its military ships to prevent the Greeks, the Cypriots, the Israelis from exploring the gas fields. So now it seems to be in a much better, much more positive environment. Apart from that, I could not give you the last up-to-date situation on the let's say the business side, but let's say that diplomatically the situation has been clarified, because a lot of the issues at the diplomatic level related to the borders, the maritime borders, and how that affected the possibility of gas exploration. Last year, Israel also found a way to get an agreement with Lebanon, because Lebanon was also involved in these discussions on gas. So what we see at the moment is that with regards to gas in the East Mediterranean, the issue of border disputes seems more or less settled. Apart from that, with regards to the business side, again, my understanding is that the main actors, those that have the know-how, are the Israelis, the Americans, and sometimes some European companies. And that's one of the reasons Israel has been involved, for instance, in the gas projects of our countries, such as Egypt. But it's definitely a good illustration that common interests in terms of energy probably motivated the reconciliation at the diplomatic level.
to our online audience. Please.
Sorry, there's a lot of speculations about how the Abraham Accords can extend, and a lot of attention is on what Saudi would do and how that would. But how would the bilateral relations between Israel and Turkey, considering Turkey does have a bit of good influence in terms of the Islamic rich in Asia and all, so how do you think that relationship between Israel and Turkey could influence the extension of Abraham Accords?
I don't think so far we saw Turkey playing that role, a role of let's say enabler of closer relations between Israel and the Muslim world. Well, one of the obvious reasons is that you had the dispute between Israel and Turkey until last year, and there is still uncertainty how far both countries can really cooperate. In a sense, it's easier to cooperate when you have shared interest on economy, on energy. On ideology, it's more complicated because there's still questions regarding Turkey and, let's say, organizations close to the Muslim Brotherhood. And actually, Turkey has reduced a lot of the presence of Muslim Brotherhood-affiliated organizations in Turkey since last year, but things are still to move on this. There's also the issue that initially Turkey had bad relations with the countries of the Abraham Accords. Turkey had bad relations with the UAE until recently. Keep in mind that the UAE, as well as Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, had demanded the closure of the Turkish military base in Qatar at the time of the blockade in 2017. So it meant that Turkey doesn't really have the ability to influence decisions for Israel here. And also it relates again to something, as I mentioned, like the mistress syndrome. The UAE and Bahrain are quite exceptional in a way, in the sense that they are very public and are quite comfortable with the idea of talking about their relations with Israel and to promote their relations with Israel. But Turkey has always been much more ambivalent. As I said, there was strategic military consultations for decades, but Turkey had to cope with its population that was very pro-Palestinian and openly against Israel. So I don't think they wanted to play any role in supporting, let's say, Israel's relations with other Muslim countries. There's the idea that Turkey played a role in getting Israel close to Azerbaijan, but it doesn't seem to be something concrete. The Israel-Azerbaijan relations seem to be much more through the bilateral channel than through a Turkish facilitator. So that's probably the reason why we don't see yet any Turkish involvement on that.
Thank you so much. Okay, please.
Thank you. A very nice presentation. From my very limited understanding of the Middle East, just wanted to know your views that, the Palestine-Israel conflict, it's the defining, issue over there. So going forward, do you see any progress in this aspect? And I believe it could have repercussions, throughout the world, and especially all types of relations.
That's a challenging question. I have to answer the Israel-Palestine question in just a few minutes. But no, more seriously, it's important to ask the question because too often we forget that this elephant in the room, that the Israel-Palestine conflict has not been solved. In the current environment, I'm very pessimistic for different reasons. But if I had to give a simple answer, I would say that on both sides, the situation is definitely not favorable. You have in Israel probably the most far-right government in the history of the country. When you have ministers such as Itamar Ben-Gvir, and even just the fact that we consider Benjamin Netanyahu as the moderate element in the government, that tells you how tough this government is. So clearly, there's no. I wouldn't expect anything in terms of progress on the Palestinian issue with that government. And we saw that even if there is a hope for normalization with Saudi Arabia, I doubt that this government, with this current lineup, would accept any concession on Palestine. I don't think this government would say we accept a Palestinian state in exchange for recognition with Saudi Arabia. I don't think they will do that, because that's not what their constituency would accept. That's for Israel. But even with regards to Palestinian situation, it's extremely negative, because you have, on one hand, the Palestinian Authority, which is in a terrible situation. It's extremely weak. It's extremely unpopular. If we look at the polls, it's perceived as a corrupted organization. Mahmoud Abbas has been in power for 2 decades, is extremely old, actually, and is just not able to make the decisions that will be necessary to put the Palestinian as a credible interlocutor. And the other alternative, if it's not Abbas at the moment, is Hamas, and that's even worse. But that's the worst case scenario, which is unfortunately getting more likely each year. The fact that Hamas is powerful not only just in Gaza, but is gaining more powerful in the West Bank. That would be a terrible scenario, because that I don't think having Netanyahu on one hand and Hamas on the other hand, we would see a new Oslo peace process. But that's the reason why, in the current situation, realistically, I don't think we'll see anything new. The only thing we can hope is the suspension of the new settlements. That's a very low point in terms of expectations, because they announced new settlements, which is also very unprecedented in terms of the scale of the new settlements we're talking about. But the only thing we can expect is that Netanyahu does not go further on this.
Thank you so much. Before we go further, I have a question from an online audience on the same. I'll just read it verbatim. From Hanan, he asks, are we going to talk about Hamas and not apartheid Israel is practicing on Palestinians? Before you answer this question, I know for a fact that Iranians use this word apartheid regime, for Israel. Is there any other country which actually uses it, or is it correct to use this term for Israel? Iranians use it all the time.
Wait, so the question relates to Hamas or to
no,
apartheid?
Basically, the questioner has noted that you have talked about the missiles being fired from Hamas side. Maybe he is inquiring why you have not talked about the Israeli side, and their exigencies towards Palestinians. This is my inference to this question.
Okay, well, I mean, the simple answer is that I was talking about the perception seen from Israel. Of course, I'm not saying that you have. I wasn't making a normative statement. I was explaining that when you are in the position of Israel, you consider that your major threat is rockets or missiles being fired from Gaza. It doesn't justify the Israeli practices in Gaza, such as naval blockade that I mentioned, or the restrictions on the liberty of movement and the economic, humanitarian damages or consequences that comes with the Israeli policy. At the same time, Israel is not technically occupying Gaza. Gaza is governed by Hamas, so a lot of the daily suffering for the people in Gaza comes also from Hamas. So it's not a situation where you have a good and a bad, a good player, bad player. That doesn't play in the Middle East.
Sure. I hope Hanan has been satisfied by your answer. And there's another question from an online audience. Saman Omar asks, what implications do Israeli-Turkish ties have for U.S. interests in the Middle East? He is from Security Studies researcher, Kurdistan region of Iraq.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the response is simple in a way for the U.S. and actually on both Democrat and Republican administrations. They historically saw both countries as their closest partners and in a way bridges in the Middle East. They, as mentioned before, Turkey became a NATO member in the 50s. So very quickly, the US looked at Turkey as one of its anchors for its Middle East policy. Same thing for Israel, and it's a bipartisan perception. They consider that Israel until today is a strategic partner, meaning that there is a strategic value for Washington to keep supporting Israel. And we saw that most recently with discussions during the Republican primary, where there was a discussion about the relevance of US aid to Israel, with candidates which were strongly supporting that, saying that this is a US national interest. And in a way, just to go back to the initial question, this also explains, in the case of Turkey, why the US decided to abandon, during the Trump administration, the Kurdish forces. Because at the end of the day, there is this realistic, pragmatic view in Washington, and I think for the Biden administration it's the same, that relations with Turkey, even though they are difficult with Erdogan, they are more important than supporting Kurdish forces in Syria. So at the tactical level, the US needed the Kurdish forces, but diplomatically they wanted to preserve their relations with Turkey. That's, in a way, you could say that's a very cynical game, but that was the priority seen from the US perspective.
Great, thank you. Is there any other question from the audience side from here? So let me just ask maybe one final question, because this Israel and Palestinian issue, it's been very sensitive one. The term that people use, apartheid, things like that, is not actually appropriate. And there are some countries who specifically use when they are at war with this country, like, as I said, Iran, which is not widely accepted, this terminology. But putting it in the broader context, this whole issue of Israel and Palestine, like Israelis, an ethnic minority, fighting for a statehood, and now they have attained a state. Now, Palestinians, again, a sort of minority, they have also been fighting for the same cause and trying or striving to attain a statehood. Now, there's another ethnic minority, that is the Kurdish, and there's a questioner from that region also. And this actually percolates to the four countries: Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. So what do you see the future of the struggle of this Kurdish minority, and how does it impact the bilateral relationship between Israel and Turkey? Is there any dimension of this particular element between Israel and Turkey, this Kurdish issue?
Well, I mean, Israel historically, Israel had ties, cultivated ties with Kurdish leadership, in particular in Iraq. That was actually as old as in the 50s, because as you mentioned, there was this common perception that the Kurdish project was similar to the Israeli project. So there was, I would say, a combination of romanticism about the commonalities between the Israelis and the Kurds, but at the same time there was strategic pragmatism, because the Israelis thought supporting the Kurds in Iraq, supporting the Christians in Lebanon, this was creating some kind of alliance of minorities in the Middle East against the Muslim Arabs. Basically, that was the. So, but apart from that, and there were from time to time cooperation, military cooperation between Israel and the Kurds. I don't think this really reached the point of creating tensions with Turkey. At least for the last decade, I don't recall a moment where Israel's relations with the Kurds, which again are limited, became an element of the dispute between Erdogan and Netanyahu. This was more actually on the Palestinian issue. The real issue for Turkey was on Israel and Palestine. That I mentioned the Marmara situation, but relations got also very tense because Turkey started to become an active player in Palestinian politics, supporting Hamas, and as a result, condemned systematically any Israeli operation in the Palestinian territories. So that is more the issue at stake than the Kurdish issue. The other question you had was with regards to the Kurdish project itself. Well, I mean, I don't want to make bold predictions that, and especially because we record that, you could watch this in 5 years from now and think this guy was really stupid. But it doesn't seem, again, here also very pessimistic in a way. I don't see elements that go in the direction of Kurdish independence. If we look at the Iraqi context, which probably was the most encouraging one, the current situation doesn't seem to be favorable for that. So in Syria or Turkey, that's probably even worse. But so that I don't see any major progress on that. I know that for obviously for Kurds, but also for historians, scholars that have been working on this for many years, this is in a way one of the many tragedies of the Middle East. This minority, as we saw on the map, that has a very significant presence across 4 countries, with something that could really be a country, which until today, until 2023, has not been able to build that national project. But yeah, I think there's combination of regional interests, also fragmentation of Kurdish politics as well. We're not talking about one Kurdish movement only. So I'll stop here. I'm sorry, I'm taking much too long.
Thank you so much. Let me just see if we have any more question. Okay, I have one. Since his re-election, President Erdogan has seemingly moved to a more conventional path in governance, returning to conventional economic theory and slightly smoother ties with the US. Is this a blip or perhaps a reflection of something else? Slightly longer question.
It's hard to say because the election was just a few months ago. So it's hard to say if there's a shift in Erdogan's policy and attitude. The only thing we know is that there have been hopes in the past that he would be more moderate, and each time he actually doubled down on his assertive attitude. There are signs for sure that he seems more reasonable, and he seems interested into getting better ties with the U.S. administration, especially also because of the situation in Ukraine. The gamble, in a way, between the Turkish gamble with Russia on the S-400 and on good relations diplomatically with Putin put Erdogan in an odd situation after the Ukraine invasion. So I guess at the moment, and we saw that with the ultimate decision not to block the membership of Sweden within NATO, Turkey is also conveying the message that it is not trying to put an end to its Western partnerships, and in particular to its relations with the US. It doesn't change the fact that it's no longer part of the F-35 program, which is a major loss for Turkey. It's a significant loss, not just operationally for the Turkish Air Force, but diplomatically, economically, this is a tremendous loss. But on other fields, they seem to be more moderate. But again, we'll see 1 or 2 years from now if that's a real trend or if it was just a short, temporary attitude from Erdogan.
Thank you so much. I think that should be it as far as question and answer rounds are concerned. Thank you so much for this fascinating learning journey. Dealing with non-Arab countries is actually very difficult. You know, I've been dealing with them all the time, but you handled all the questions very well. And I thank everyone, you as well as all the audience for participating in this lecture. Especially I would thank Aisha, Isha and Sharon, their team, for putting the whole lecture together. And I hope you all will continue to attend these lectures. The next lecture is on climate change by our colleague Aisha. And with that, okay, on Wednesday, we also have a book launch event of the book that I mentioned, right? Yes, that's actually a very good book on the Middle East security. We don't have such reasonable, dealing of this complex subject, the architecture that is actually so abstract, but somebody is dealing with that in a tangible format. So it will be a very interesting discussion. So with that, I thank you all once again. Thank you so much. And from me, goodbye for now.
Thank you.